Well, welcome to another opportunity to ask Andrew a question about church planting. And the one we've got for you today, Andrew, someone has asked, what's the best way to gather a core if you're parachuting in from somewhere? So I take it the person doesn't really come into this area, they're not local from this area. How would they suddenly go about getting people to support a church plant?
Yeah. It's a good question. I think we've got to do a bit more parachuting church planting as well, and so it's going to be a big one over the years. Look, the first thing to say, it's hard. There's no two ways about it. Australia is a hard place, and we have a lower proportion of Christians and have not lots of people roaming around asking, how can I be saved? And so for the most part, we're hacking it out of dry soil. So it is a hard thing to do. I remember in the early years of our plant up here, every new contact, it was like gold. If I got the name of someone from some kind of investigation somewhere that someone mentioned a friend of a friend, if I got that, I chased it all the way down. It was like finding a secret surf spot or something. You kind of put it away, you made sure you looked after it, and you chased them through. Not as a stalker, but you chased it all the way down as much as you could.
Yeah.
And so that is the first thing to say. It is hard, and you need to make every person you do connect with follow it through. Look, that's the negative side. There is a positive. I read a stat just recently, actually, in Australia, that something like 35% of Australians would go to church if they were asked. It's interesting. There's a lot more people out there who, if they could connect with a Christian, they've got some interest, sufficient interest to perhaps pursue it through. So that's another thing just to bear in mind. But a bunch of stuff, I reckon, is the answer to this. I think as you do it, as you kind of parachute in and you start to make contacts and so on, the best way to do it is that you ensure you come across as a lifesaver, not a church planter. Let me explain what I mean.
No, I think I can understand where you're going, yeah.
Yeah, look, I want to start here because the key to gathering a core group, a launch team, a church, humanly speaking, is us as the leadership. And people are drawn to the beauty of the gospel, to the beauty of Christ, seen in you, the planter. And if you go around making contacts primarily seeking to connect them to start a church, then they'll catch that. And they'll sense this as kind of an institutional thing.
Mm.
But if you're primarily seeking to connect them to start a fire in their hearts for Jesus and to connect them to the life-saving gospel, that they can be transformed into everything that Christ intends for them. And so if you're sending this constant message that I'm here to bring you life and I'm connecting with you because I want you to join in this team to be part of bringing life in knowing Christ, then people will sense that and it'll be infectious.
Yeah, the core group you're talking about, though, starts to sound to me like you're talking about conversions. So how you're going to build the core group of the church from people who may not be churched, who may not have a commitment with Christ.
Yeah.
They're not the sort of people you're going to be able to run a church with initially, though, are they? I mean, is there any way, I don't know how nicely to put this, is there any way to go in and find Christians in the area and detach them for this cause?
Oh, look, well, on that, we want to run evangelistic church plants. And so we want to help each other be evangelists and get out there and connect with people and so on. So I want to underline that. We're not there just to shift the deck chairs around and so on and move people. But having said that, there is, building a launch team particularly, you do want to find people who can partner you in that work. And that's what I said earlier about you begin to make a noise around the place that I'm looking to plant a church in this area. You work your contacts in networks. You might even meet the ministers in the local area. You might just raise it with friends and family and so on. And it's surprising under God prayerfully how many contacts you do find of the friend of a friend of a friend who might be interested in joining this vision and being part of this work, even being prepared to move in and parachute in with you as well. But I just in addition to that, I want to say though that so you might bring half a dozen or so like that into an area, into a region that you could parachute into. You might pick up half a dozen more like that. But really we've got to then be thinking evangelistic planting. We've got to think, how can or reclamation planting. How can I find the people who were in church 5 years ago, who have not been going anywhere, and draw them back? How can I find the people who are up for a challenge that they just want to get their teeth into? How can we find all of that? And at that point, you've got to let your mind run free. You've got to say, look, there's all kinds of ways. And for mine, there's two kinds of ways I make contact in the community when I've parachuted into it. And there's the broad, shallow way, and there's the narrow, deep way. And there's a spectrum between those two. But
do you want to give us a bit of an example of one of each so we can get a sense of what you're saying?
Yeah. The broad, shallow is the kind of connecting you do where you touch lots of people, but you touch them shallowly. So it's the letterbox dropping, it's the posters in the shops, it's on telegraph poles, it's the ad in a paper, it's an editorial about a community interest story about a new church starting, and here's the picture of the family, and it's all of those broad connections that touch a lot of people, but do it shallowly. In that, you get the low fruit. You do find the person who's already thinking, who was in a church 5 years ago, and the whole idea of a fresh new start, they can be drawn along. You create a noise, you get a background recognition for the church and so on. So there's the broad, shallow. You can add to that the big public stuff to create noise. Our Saturday guys here, we've got a Saturday night church. They, I thought brilliantly, they went to the local fete, and it only took a dozen of them. They went to the local fete and ran a foot washing stall. And it's a kind of a twist on the kissing booth.
Yeah,
but it's a foot washing stall. They had a queue. They had a queue of people, and a guy and a girl washing feet, and the name of the church, all that kind of deal. It doesn't take much, and it's quite a low cost thing to put on. In our way back, we ran an outdoor carols, and we didn't have all the resources ourselves, so we just sold the vision to some friends outside of our region, and they came in and helped us put on this big carols, and we publicised it, and we made a big noise, and so it's getting profile. So there's the broad, shallow thing, but then there's the narrow, kind of deep connection, where you work your relationship networks. So I joined local sporting clubs. Very early on, I was in the local surf club. Still am. I've joined water polo club. I'm in all those kind of clubs, trying to connect with people and make contact. The local school through my kids. Now that's powerful because you touch fewer people, but you touch them more deeply. And if you've got the half a dozen in your core that's starting to form, to get them doing that work as well is quite powerful. But I've got a but here. It's important to see that in Australia, the narrow, deep work is very slow, very slow. I've been in sporting clubs now for 14 years. I've seen a couple of families connect and join. That's a lot of work. Now, in between all of that, you've got broad, shallow, narrow, deep. You've got an in-between thing of, door knocking.
Yeah.
Where you do the adopt a block thing. So you regularly door knock the same place, the same suburb. So you start to find out within a month who the warm contacts are, and then you can start to focus on them. Whereas when you join the sporting club, there might not be a warm contact in any of the networks you join with. So it's slow, hard work.
In a sense, you're coming to them on a different front. You're talking to them primarily about surfing before you're talking to them about Christianity.
Yeah. They've not come there to talk to you about all that makes it. But door knocking,
you're straight up front. Yeah,
I've knocked on the door and said, "This is what I'm about," and you'll find that who are about the same thing, and you can move forward. Now, it seems to me in those early years, we did a combination. So you've got to do the broad, shallow thing to create noise and get the low fruit. We did some, as I say, we did some narrow, deep stuff. And I think where you've got to focus heavily is the in-between. And you love and disciple everyone you've got. You work them, you encourage them to be doing the relational stuff, join you in the broad stuff, all the rest.
Now, I'm going to just shift you a little bit off topic for a second, because I think there's a related matter here. We're talking about touching the community around you, making the contacts, making the most of them. There's going to be some other contacts in that area, like, for example, the local churches and the ministers of those churches, or the pastors of those churches, who you're going to form some form of relationship with, one way or another. Now, I understand you're an expert at working out relationships with pastors in the local area. So maybe you'd just like to say to people, as they're going around building core groups, you might want to give some hints about how to relate to what is, the presence that might be there already.
It's probably worth asking someone else, Mark. Yeah, look,
benefits of a rough road, mate. What would you say?
Yeah, look, our church started in a difficult context and circumstance, some of which I take responsibility for, but some of which was that we started in a time when church planting was somewhat new. What we did, no one had done before in the country. Was quite a tense time.
I just say, because some people can feel very threatened, even like-minded ministers might feel threatened by the creation of a new core somewhere abouts. How would you manage that? What would you say to people? How would you try and manage that?
Oh, yeah. We did meet with all the ministers in the local area. Before I came up here, I met with numbers of ministers to find out how they felt about a new evangelical church starting. And the men I met with were all positive and encouraged us to come and said the need was great, come and join us. One of those, when the reality of us starting happened, changed his mind quite profoundly and said, no, it's wrong that you've come. We met with them, we sought to be gracious, we prayed. When people come to you from those churches, we sent them back. One of the guys on our staff at the moment, actually, a man called Glenn, he always tells a story about when he first arrived at our church in 2000, it was. I said to him, no, go back. Go back to the church you're at. You're at a church where they teach the Bible, they know the gospel. What are you doing here? We're doing the same thing. And it took him a year to get up the courage to come back again. And then we talked through with him about, look, if this is really what you're determined to do, you're an adult. Go and talk to your pastor, though. Work it out through the processes of appropriate leadership and structure. And so don't just disappear from there and turn up here. We don't want that to happen for your spiritual health and for the health of the church you've left. We want to talk it through in partnership. I think one of the best things I did was I gathered... no one wanted ministers fraternal, so it was a bit awkward, partly geographical and so on, but I gathered a bunch of the guys who were like-minded and we just read theological books together. So a number of the ministers who were Reformed Evangelical, we got them together and we began to meet regularly, and that built some friendships and some relationships and a sense of partnership in the work. And they were remarkable men. They and still are. They're quite extraordinary.
Let me see if I've got this then. So basically, openness about your motives to the people who might be working on the ground there, respect for their congregations, and saying to people, look, handling the potential for cross, just transfer growth, and then trying to manage some form of relationship long term with them. I realise that it doesn't always work out, but I guess you're trying to remember. The reason why I bring this up, because it sounds like you've got to have, when you're building a core, a faith that God is going to build the core. Otherwise you'd just be trying every trick you possibly could to get everybody in the building.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, thanks, mate. You put it very well. That's good. All of that. That's a good
Oh, I'm
summary.
just listening, mate. That's all I'm doing.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
just listening.
it's a very good summary. And it's a helpful point too that as you do the connecting with people, one of the problems in the early stage of a church plant is you're desperate. You know, my survival depends on this thing becoming viable. And again, people pick up that vibe of your fear and insecurity, which won't help them spiritually, and it won't help the core group spiritually. And so to cultivate, really, this is, again, who you are. Cultivate your own spiritual maturity, that you trust God, that you're in it for the long haul, that you're waiting upon Him, you're prayerful about it all. Your greatest concern is not the institution of this church, but the spiritual lives of people around you. And so even though you might desperately need a person who comes to stick with you to make it work, you've got to keep spiritually aware that it's their maturity and their life with Christ that matters more than this institution. And so that helps me to be free to say to some people, no, look, spiritually, you'd be better to go back. It's more important for the health of you and your church. And I sacrifice what I desperately need at that point. Now that's, under God, something He blesses.
Mate, I think that's an excellent point to end on. If anybody would like to actually ask Andrew a question, you've been interested in what's happening, or you want to follow up, you want to carpet him on how he's answered something, feel free. The address is going to come up on the screen in a couple of minutes. Just send in your email and have a chance to check out Church Planning with Andrew. Thanks, mate.
Pleasure.